There are two passages of scripture that have always fascinated me. One is in James chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, which says, "You lust and do not have, you murder and covet and cannot obtain, you fight and war, yet you do not have because you do not ask." That's a pretty simple statement. You do not have because you do not ask. In verse 3, he says, "You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss." And that word amiss means for selfish reasons. He says that you may spend it on your pleasures. So that's always fascinated me. James 4, verses 2 and 3, talking about you have not because you ask not. The other passage is Matthew chapter 17, verses 19 to 21, which says, verse 19, "Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, 'Why could we not cast it out?'" And prior to this, Jesus had cast out a demon. Verse 20, "So Jesus said to them, 'Because of your unbelief. For assuredly I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. However, this kind of faith, does not go out except by prayer and fasting." I don't know about you, but I've actually tried this before. You know, when you think about Jesus saying, if you had faith as a mustard seed, of course, a mustard seed is a very tiny seed, you can't hardly see it. But if you had just that much faith, you could say to this mountain, move, and it would move. And I've tried that before. I've looked at a mountain and said, move from here to there. I've even closed my eyes. I don't know why, but just close your eyes and I want you to move from here to there. And when I open my eyes, the mountain's still over there. So I've tried this before. And as far as you have not because you ask not, I mean, I've asked for things before and Lord, would you do this or do that? But again, it's important to note that third verse in James chapter 4, you ask and don't receive because you ask amiss, or you ask for selfish reasons. But I've often wondered, wouldn't it be nice if there was an example in the Bible of someone exercising these two great truths, mustard seed faith and you have not because you ask not, so that we could kind of see them in action? Well, I believe there is. Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33. Just to sort of set the context here, this passage takes place right after the Matthew's account of the feeding of the 5,000, and actually he says there were 5,000 men, not counting the women and children. So they've guesstimated it could have been 10, 15, I've even seen numbers as high as 20,000 by the time you factor in the women and children. But that passage where he feeds the 5,000 men is described in verses 15 to verse 21 from just 5 loaves and 2 fish. Certainly a miracle, no question about it. But this takes place right after that. In verse 22, it says, "Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he sent the multitudes away." Again, we don't know for sure how large the crowd was. There were 5,000 men, could have been as high as 20,000. Again, it's just a guesstimate, but there were thousands and thousands of people. So Jesus says, get in the boat, you guys get in the boat, I'm going to send the multitudes away. Verse 23, "And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now, when evening came, he was alone there." You know, this is an interesting side note that we see Jesus often praying by himself. And we know that during Jesus' ministry of 3.5 years, he had a very busy schedule. But if Jesus made the priority to pray, that should tell us how important prayer is. And we too need to make prayer a priority. But Jesus went up to pray by himself. He's sort of fortifying himself with prayer, which Jesus did often. And now it's evening time and Jesus was alone. Verse 24 says, "But the boat was now in the middle of the sea." This, of course, is the Sea of Galilee, "tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary." The Sea of Galilee was like 13 miles long and a little bit over 8 miles wide. So if they were in the middle of the sea, which is what it says here in verse 24, then they were about 4 miles into the middle. And verse 25 says, "Now in the 4th watch of the night," that was between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., "Jesus went to them walking on the sea." I'm sure many, if not everyone watching this, has been on a boat before. I've been on a boat before many times, although I've never been on a boat on the ocean. But this is a smaller lake, as I said, 13 miles long by a little over 8 miles wide. Still a good-sized lake. But I've never been on the boat when someone's approached me walking on water. I've never witnessed that before. Remember, many of these disciples made their living on the Sea of Galilee. They were fishermen. And so with the winds being contrary, they were very familiar with the conditions there on the Sea of Galilee. And between 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning, to look out and see someone walking on the sea, that would be startling. Look at their response in verse 26. It says, "And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, 'It is a ghost,' and they cried out for fear." You know, when it says they were troubled, I guess so, as my kids used to say, duh. I would be troubled too. And their conclusion, it has to be a ghost. And it says they cried out for fear. Literally, they're screaming. And hey, I don't blame them at all. Even though they're experienced fishermen on that very sea, you don't see people walking on the water, period, let alone being between 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning. But in verse 27, very interesting thing here. It says, "But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, 'Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid.'" Jesus instantly comforting them, realizing they're afraid, tells them not to be afraid. But then something very interesting happens. Again, going to those two passages that I started with in James chapter 4 and also in Matthew, it says in verse 28, "And Peter answered him and said, 'Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water.'" So here we have Peter saying, "Lord, if it's you, let me come out on the water." I know some Bible commentaries criticize Peter for asking, which I think is a shame that they would conclude that, because Jesus doesn't criticize him. We'll see that here in just a second. But again, thinking about the James chapter 4 passage, "You have not because you ask not." Listen to the Lord's response here in verse 29. "And he said, 'Come.'" Jesus doesn't criticize him. That's why, again, it's sort of shocking that someone would conclude that Peter shouldn't have asked. Jesus doesn't criticize him at all. But it says, "And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus." I remember reading another commentary years ago that said, well, he only took a couple steps, which I kind of find comical for several reasons. I've never walked on the water, obviously, but even if he just took a couple steps, I don't know about you, but I would be very impressed with that, because I've never taken any steps. First of all, the passage does not say how many steps that he took. It just simply says Jesus told him to come, and it says Peter got down out of the boat and walked on the water to go to Jesus. So in my estimation, if he only took one step, that would impress me. But again, it doesn't tell us how many steps that he took. Verse 30 says, "But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, 'Lord, save me.'" He takes his eyes off Jesus, and he takes his focus off Jesus. He starts looking around at his surroundings. He notices the wind and the waters, and he begins to sink. And I've always said, every time I've looked at this passage over the years as a pastor, when he says, "Lord, save me," and again, it says he cried out, so he's screaming. This is the shortest prayer in the Bible, because he wouldn't take long to sink. And so, "Lord, save me," and the very end of that's probably kind of garbled as he's starting to take in water. But notice what happens in verse 31. It says, "And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, 'O you of little faith, why did you doubt?'" I find this fascinating. Peter had just taken steps onto the water. Why didn't Andrew walk on the water? Because Andrew didn't ask. Why didn't Matthew walk on the water? Because Matthew didn't ask. And we could go through the whole list of disciples with the same answer. Why didn't they walk on the water? They didn't ask. So I think we have an example here of James chapter 4. You have not because you ask not. But I think we also have an example, at least I think, of mustard seed faith, telling this mountain to move and it'll move. I mean, Peter can't walk on water. Jesus, of course, can, because he's God in the flesh. But Peter, you can't walk on water. But Jesus told him when he asked to come on the water. And he starts walking on the water, which to me is a demonstration of mustard seed faith. And yet, when Jesus catches him and brings him back in, he says, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" You know, doubt will get us in a lot of trouble. That's one of the things that the enemy tries to do in tempting us, is to get us to doubt. Verse 32 says, "And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased." Yet another miracle. which I would love to see. I would love to have a video of this. I would put a link in the description if I had a video of Jesus getting in the boat and the sea is calm. I know they've dramatized this in movies and they do a pretty good job with technology, but this would have been something to behold. Verse 33 says, "Then those who were in the boat came and worshiped him, saying, 'Truly you are the Son of God.'" Well, again, as I said, I really think we have an example here in Matthew 14 of those two wonderful truths: you have not because you ask not, and mustard seed faith. And it leads me to ask the question, how much faith do I have? Do you have mustard seed faith? Well, again, thank you for visiting The Essential Truth. This is Pastor Dave. You have a blessed day.